Jeff Beck is remembered as one of the most extraordinary guitarists in rock history. He reshaped the electric guitar, broke musical boundaries, and carved out entirely new paths for others to follow. Yet, away from the spotlight, Beck carried something darker. A lifelong bitterness toward six of the biggest names in music. This wasn't just the usual rivalry between performers. For Beck, it was betrayal, disappointment, and in some cases, the feeling of being robbed by those he once called brothers. These grudges never faded, and they cast long shadows over his career, even during his brightest moments. Today we're pulling back the curtain to reveal the six names Jeff Beck never forgave. The Rolling Stones, at the very top of Beck's hate list, stood none other than the Rolling Stones. To most people, joining the Stones would have been the opportunity of a lifetime. They offered global recognition, money beyond imagination, and a permanent place in rock history. But to Beck, they represented everything he despised: chaos, looseness, and a total lack of discipline. The story dates back to the mid-1970s, when the Stones were looking for a new guitarist. Mick Jagger and Keith Richards admired Beck's playing, and his name came up repeatedly as a serious candidate. Almost any musician would have leapt at the chance, but Beck didn't see it as a dream. To him, it was a nightmare. He tried rehearsing with the band, and it quickly became one of the worst experiences of his career. Beck later admitted bluntly, "I couldn't deal with their looseness. I like bottled attention and discipline. Get the damn thing done, and then you can mess around." This wasn't just a polite rejection. It was open contempt. He couldn't respect a group that thrived on improvisation and swagger. To Beck, it wasn't genius. It was laziness masquerading as brilliance. During rehearsals, songs stretched endlessly with no clear structure. Jagger cracked jokes. Richards drifted into random riffs, and the whole thing felt like a party rather than a professional session. Beck, who valued precision and intensity, was furious. He wasn't angry because he couldn't play their music. He was angry because he hated the way they played it. Walking away from the Stones cost him dearly. Years later, he admitted, with regret, "And the Rolling Stones, I could have, I'd have been all right financially, couldn't I? It would not have been bad." It was pride and regret rolled into one. He despised their methods, but he also knew what he had given up. The Stones went on to become billionaires, global icons, and the greatest rock and roll band in the world. Beck, meanwhile, stayed admired by fellow musicians and critics, but never reached their mainstream fame. This grudge haunted him for life. To Beck, joining the Stones would have meant selling out to chaos, but he could never quite forget what he had sacrificed. Led Zeppelin, next on Beck's blacklist, was Led Zeppelin, and this feud cut far deeper. This wasn't only about music, it was about betrayal. Beck and Jimmy Page were more than peers. They were Yardbirds bandmates, partners in pushing the guitar into uncharted territory. But when Page formed Led Zeppelin in 1968, Beck didn't see it as the birth of a new supergroup. He saw it as theft. In 1968, Beck released his landmark album, Truth. Critics today call it a blueprint for hard rock and heavy metal. Heavy, raw, and revolutionary, with Beck's thunderous guitar alongside Rod Stewart's vocals and Ronnie Wood's bass. But just months later, Zeppelin's debut album arrived, and the comparisons were immediate. To the average fan, Zeppelin sounded like the future. To Beck, they sounded like a copy. He never forgave it. According to Yardbirds historian Greg Russo, Beck privately said Page was a cunning businessman who built his empire out of ideas. The two of them had pioneered together. Beck saw himself as the true innovator, and Page as the opportunist who cashed in. The frustration grew as Zeppelin skyrocketed into global fame. By the early 1970s, Zeppelin were selling out stadiums and rewriting the business of rock. Beck, by contrast, struggled with unstable lineups and smaller crowds. Every Zeppelin triumph reminded him of the success that might have been his. He once snapped to fellow musicians, "Page built a castle out of bricks we laid together." It summed up his bitterness, not jealousy of fame, but anger at being erased. The tragedy is that Beck and Page could have been remembered as partners, twin architects of hard rock. Instead, Page became the legend, while Beck became the outsider, brilliant but overshadowed. Yngwie Malmsteen. The third name Beck couldn't stand was Yngwie Malmsteen, the Swedish shredder who rose to fame in the 1980s with his lightning-fast neoclassical guitar style. Fans adored Malmsteen's Baroque scales and arpeggios, calling him a genius. But Beck dismissed him as a show-off, turning centuries of classical tradition into shallow guitar gymnastics. Beck respected Malmsteen's technical skill, but despised what he saw as its emptiness. In Beck's view, every note should carry meaning and emotion. Malmsteen's music, by contrast, was all speed, no soul. In 1986, Beck publicly declared, "Classical music deserves respect, not exploitation for showing off." He was talking about Malmsteen and the entire neoclassical metal movement. At festivals, Beck was even harsher, mocking Malmsteen by saying, "Vivaldi wrote beautiful music to express human emotions, not to provide backing tracks for guitar masturbation." Harsh words, but they revealed how sacred classical music was to Beck. For him, it wasn't about finger patterns or flashy speed. It was about emotion, structure, and honesty. Malmsteen symbolized the opposite, spectacle without depth. 2. Beck, this wasn't just a personal feud, it was a cultural war over what music should be. Eric Clapton, fourth on the list, is perhaps the most painful of all. Eric Clapton. Beck and Clapton shared the same roots, both Yardbirds alumni, both devoted to the blues. Yet they came to represent opposite philosophies. Clapton became the keeper of tradition, hailed as a god for his faithful devotion to pure blues. Beck became the experimenter, twisting the blues into new forms with jazz fusion, electronics, and innovation. To Beck, Clapton wasn't a hero. He was a jailer. He once called him a museum curator who's afraid to disturb the exhibits. In other words, someone who preserved tradition instead of pushing it forward, while critics crowned Clapton as the ultimate authority on blues rock. Beck fumed. He sneered that Clapton's success came from blues fundamentalism that mistakes repetition for authenticity. For Beck, the true blues masters, Robert Johnson, Muddy Waters, were innovators in their time. Clapton, in his view, was embalming their legacy, not honoring it. The rivalry was quieter than some of Beck's others, but among musicians it was no secret. Beck couldn't stand that the world worshipped Clapton's conservatism, while dismissing his own daring experiments as eccentric. To him, Clapton wasn't preserving the blues, he was suffocating it. Eddie Van Halen landing at number 5. Is Eddie Van Halen the Californian virtuoso who redefined guitar in the late 1970s? Eddie's tapping technique and dazzling stage presence made him a legend. But to Beck, it was empty flash. When Van Halen released their debut in 1978, Eddie's solo eruption stunned the world. But Beck scoffed, calling it a circus act. He saw Eddie's style as acrobatics, finger exercises masquerading as art. In 1981, Beck warned in an interview, "Innovation means expanding what music can express, not just finding new ways to play fast." He didn't name Eddie directly, but everyone knew who he meant. As Eddie's fame exploded, Beck's resentment deepened. Van Halen were headlining arenas, selling millions of records, and Eddie was hailed as the greatest guitarist of his generation. Meanwhile, Beck was experimenting with fusion and electronic textures in smaller circles, admired but not adored. The grudge was generational as much as personal. Eddie symbolized youth, spectacle, and flash. Beck stood for discipline, subtlety, and depth. Where Eddie played for the crowd, Beck played for the music. and he hated that audiences seemed to prefer spectacle over substance. Rod Stewart, finally. The grudge that cut the deepest, Rod Stewart. Unlike the others, this wasn't about style or technique. It was personal betrayal. In 1967, Beck formed the Jeff Beck Group with Rod Stewart on vocals and Ronnie Wood on bass. Together they created Truth and Beckola, albums that laid the groundwork for hard rock. Beck believed this band would finally propel him to stardom, but Stewart saw things differently. By the early 1970s, he was eyeing a solo career. Without warning, he left, walking out just as the band was on the edge of breaking through. Ronnie Wood later recalled, "He disappeared in the middle of the night. Next morning, he was gone." Beck felt abandoned, betrayed. Stewart's solo career quickly exploded with songs like Maggie May, making him an international superstar. To Beck, it was salt in the wound. He felt Stewart had used his band as a stepping stone and then taken the glory for himself. The betrayal left scars. Beck grew distrustful of singers and increasingly preferred instrumental projects where no vocalist could overshadow him. Friends said he never fully forgave Stewart, often bringing up the departure with anger, even decades later. For Beck, this wasn't rivalry. It was personal. Stewart had broken his trust, and that to him was the ultimate crime.
Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon.